Welcome to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, the podcast where the certain things in life are not as certain as you may think. In today's episode, we're speaking to Big Daddy Liberty, talk show host of the Big Liberty Show and head of strategic operations at the IRR. Big Daddy Liberty, welcome to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast.
Guys, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, so I think let's start off with from your side. Tell us why are you here and give us your message.
Cool. Yeah, look, very briefly, my name is Sihle Ngobese, or I'm better known as Big Daddy Liberty. And to those who are still shocked by that name, yes, that's right, Big Daddy Liberty. And I'm a social media influencer. What I do mostly is to get involved in, firstly, bettering the country. I think we're all quite aware of the fact that we are in a bad place. The country is arguably at its lowest point, both in terms of economic data, and I can go through a whole list of things that I know you know are problematic right now. And you know them because you're feeling them, right? You know, we talk, I'm a classical liberal in terms of my political outlook or my worldview, which means I lean on the side of freedom. And as classical liberals, we speak a lot often about the individual, and the focus on the individual. But really, we're a family society. And when I talk about these issues, I refer to them in the context of how they affect families. And again, when I talk about families, both Black and white families, because unfortunately, we live in a country where, we've made race such a quote unquote important factor that to the ordinary citizen on the floor, actually race isn't the most important factor. What matters to them is being able to progress as an individual, being able to look after their families, and being able to pursue opportunities and be who they want to be with their lives. That's freedom, or rather that's what should be freedom. But unfortunately, we live in a country where people are denied this opportunity, and they're denied these opportunities in various ways. One is the fact that we just have a government which is way too big, and hates the idea of a free society. I mean, they hate the idea of, for instance, if I were to break it down racially, since that's our obsession as a country, they hate the idea of free thinking, free and prosperous, or the potential idea of prosperous Black South Africans who aren't dependent on the state, who aren't dependent on politicians. Politicians are fearful of that. So what do? They put in place policies that continue the misery of mostly poor Black South Africans. And again, when I say poor Black South Africans, I'm not saying they're the only ones who are poor. Of course, you have poverty across the color line. But we see how politicians act when it comes to keeping, mostly poor Black South Africans under their tutelage. In the second instance, they then appropriate the language of identity, and then they start segmenting us, right? So the first thing they do is they say, well, white people essentially are the prime evil of society. They're the root cause of all our problems, according to our politicians who play the identity game. And as I said, Black people are perpetual victims, that somehow we need our lords as politicians to tell us what we need to do, where we need to be, et cetera, and that somehow, in inverted commas, they'll protect us against the evil white man. That's the rhetoric. That is the political language of our time. So that when you look at our politics across the spectrum, whether it's from the ANC to the other extreme of the red in tooth and claw EFF, to even the DA, they all play the language game, they all play the identity game, race, gender, creed, your income, rich people bad, poor people victims, white people bad, Black people victims. It's just a spectrum or continuum of that sort of narrative. So who is Big Daddy Liberty then in the context of this whole mess of our politics? Big Daddy Liberty is not a politician. He's a guy. Something died. Are we still fine? Sorry about that, guys. So the question was, who is Big Daddy Liberty? He is an ordinary South African, 32, from a very challenging and poor background, raised by a single parent who's physically handicapped, but a parent who gave me every opportunity, even though she never had that opportunity, to be the best I can. So I had a very good education thanks to a parent who hustled, to get me into good schools, and I did the rest, right? So I got the opportunity and I did the rest. I had good academic grades. I got bursaries, etc., etc. And I am now a beneficiary of a parent, a family unit, which cared more about me and the unit as a family than they did about what's happening in society. And I think that's the story of all South Africans in our various ways, whether you're from a rich or poor white family or Indian family, whatever, right down to the person who sits next to you in traffic, who you don't think about. But anyway, I waffle. The point is, I am a person who cares deeply about the families in this country, who cares deeply about this country. And I want to see a South Africa that is non-racial, truly. It really doesn't really focus on race, but what it does focus on is creating families and individuals who are prosperous, who are free. So that's my mission. So if you, as you listen to this podcast, feel like you support and like the ideas, then support Big Daddy Liberty, follow Big Daddy Liberty. As I said, I'm on social media, so just search Big Daddy Liberty, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and you'll see what I'm all about.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great introduction, and even more than that, I suppose. The question that I have for you to maybe start us off is this word liberty. Now, let me explain why this is an issue for me. It's because this word is being used and abused by various people. So in 1994 and probably the years before that, you had the ANC coming out and saying, well, liberty is the government giving you a free house. Liberty is the government giving you free food, giving you free water, essentially keeping you keeping you alive. That equals liberty. Whereas nowadays you have more and more people falling perhaps all the way to the other side, saying, well, essentially that kind of a patriarchy should fall away. True liberty is having the choice. Do I want to invest in, for instance, a pension fund? And that's almost completely on the other side, where there's no one really looking out for you in the sense of traditional patriarchy. I know that nowadays patriarchy has gotten another ring to it, not necessarily as economic. So that as an introduction, what is liberty to you? When you say Big Daddy Liberty, what is that liberty?
Great question. You see, whenever we talk about liberty, you've got to understand that any society is made up of individuals first, and individuals place themselves in families. That is the most reliable structure, the first structure we have as individuals that socializes us. So any person who says, I stand for liberty, is someone who's basically saying, how can I make life as easy and as free as possible for an individual to pursue their own interests, whatever their interests are, but to pursue what they want to do with their life. Because ultimately, you have a right to your life and your freedom, your liberty. It is a God-given, if you will, right, that you have. So any person then who argues that they stand for liberty, like Big Daddy Liberty, is essentially looking out for the individual and families. That's their key focus. So then cool. So that's what you focus on, right? So then what are the things that are a risk to the individual, a risk to families? Well, usually it's bigger forms of organizations, such as the state, right? The state is a big risk for individuals. It should be a protector of individuals, but often it's a risk. And let me situate this in South Africa. South Africa has never had a period, ever, where we've had a government, for instance, that actually stands on the side of liberty. Whether you look at our colonial time, apartheid, to even today's government, none of these governments have actually really stood for the liberty of all South Africans. Each in their own ways had an interest group that they look after at the expense of someone else. In other words, you had politicians in government picking winners and losers in society. And often when you have a government that does that, the vast majority of people become a loser, regardless of what epoch you want to talk about, colonialism, apartheid or today. So what you then recognize as someone who stands for liberty is that you need to understand two things. One, the role of government, and two...
It's fine. We'll switch on the lights now.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the lights went up for those who aren't.
Automatically. We save energy here at our offices.
Oh, there you go. Eskom will be delighted to hear this. Not that they can do anything about it, because they'll literally switch off the power anyway. So sorry, to those who are listening who were able to pay attention, lol. So what is liberty then? As I said, you need to frame it around two questions. What is the responsibility of government, number one? And two, what should be the relationship of the individual to government? In each of those instances, there are three things. And if you let me indulge me, I'll be brief. The role of government. there are three things that should be the role of government. One is to protect us from foreign aggression. In other words, if Zimbabwe were to decide to invade, okay, I'm sorry, let me take that back. If Botswana were to decide to invade, we should have an army, a diplomatic corps that can deal with this, right? That is a legitimate role of the state. Ultimately, the integrity of the nation state. That is a legitimate role of the state, number one. And also a diplomatic corps, the idea that you have a presidency and some form of foreign relations that maintain good relations with the rest of the world. That is the role of the state. Number two is to protect us from internal threats, right? So, there's 55 million South Africans and, there's a big crime rate. Crime is an assault on the individual. It's an assault on your rights, either your property rights, in other words, a criminal saying, give me your car, give me your money, whatever, or a criminal trying to end your life, which, as I argued earlier on, you have your life, a right to your life and liberty. So the state has every responsibility to look out for us in that regard. In other words, a functioning police force, et cetera, et cetera. And the last role of the state is the administration of justice. Look, we have 55 million South Africans in this country, multiple cultures, 11 languages. Surely there will be conflict every now and again. I mean, it makes sense. So what you need, obviously, is a government that is able to administer and adjudicate our disputes. So if I have a dispute with Daniel, because he failed to uphold his part of the contract, because that's how we interact on a day-to-day basis, through contracts. We should be able to go to an independent third party who adjudicates the case, and justice is served. Those are the three roles of government. Anything outside of that, Big Daddy Liberty doesn't believe the state or government has a role in doing. So remember, I said there will be roles, and then the responsibilities, or rather, the relationship. What should the relationship between the individual and government be? So that's also three things. Number one, this is not so much a philosophy as it is instincts that have guided me right throughout my time. So number one is, I believe the state should do less so that the individual and families can do more. In that case, I speak about the ability for us to be able to pursue our own interests and essentially follow our own paths in life. I don't think the state should be getting in your way of doing that, and by arguing that it needs to do those things for you. Number two, the state should spend less so that the individual can spend more. Now, when I say this one, people get, sort of raise eyebrows because, we're so used to in this country of having governments that spend a lot on certain interest groups. But actually, if you have a government that steps back, understands its three roles, as I mentioned earlier on, and spends less, allowing people to spend more, you would see a greater economic prosperity. Why? Because there'd be a better distribution of income, not the redistribution of wealth. I'm sorry, I know I'm going through a lot of concepts, but there'll be a better distribution of income. Let me be precise and specific. If you had a middle class in this country that wasn't overly taxed and actually had more money in its pocket, what do you think it would do? It would save more, it would invest more, it would spend more. When you save more, when you invest more, you spend more, that money is put to use in the market. That money put to use in the market creates new stuff, industries, factories, and suddenly the poor people would have an opportunity to also become income earners. However, if you have a government that gets in the way of that by taxing heavily and arguing that it can redistribute that money better, well, what do you think happens there? The corruption. You open up the door to the corruption, the greed, and the cronyism, where you've put all this money that could be productively used suddenly in the hands of politicians. So the government should spend less so that the individual can spend more. And the last one, the more important one for me, is the government should own less so that the individual can own more. Why should you give up 40% of your income to government when that is money that could be gone into improving your house, hiring more people, building up savings, something that you can give over to your children? So that ownership, and when I talk about ownership, I also mean about property. The idea that you can build up a property portfolio and hand that wealth over to your kids. Black and white people want to do this. So don't be fooled by politicians who suggest that property rights are only for white people. Black people are just as interested in owning something and being able to bequeath that to their children and not have a government be its father figure. So that is the role of government, those three things, and the responsibilities of essentially the relationship between the individual and the state.
So if we can play a quick game of free association. If I mention a task or an action or responsibility, whatever you call it, or a role, and if you can say whether or not you feel or believe the state should be involved in that. So obviously you've said defense force and police force, which I think is quite clear. Not public healthcare in South Africa. Is that something where the state should be involved?
So look, it's a bit of an interesting one for me because I think in all the things that you'll throw out, my stock standard answer would be something like this. It would be a bit cruel to suddenly, shut off the government coffers immediately and completely. Let's say I was in power tomorrow. I wouldn't do that. That would be absolutely cruel. Why? Because you have a lot of people, millions of people, who are dependent on the state. So what I'll do rather is gradually wean people off the state by empowering them. And on these particular topics, on health, for instance, what can you do about health? Well, firstly, you don't listen to the ANC and you don't listen to the EFF. The ANC, who talk about, for instance, instituting the national health insurance, which essentially would create a massive ESCOM of health, where the government owns all health facilities, it controls everything, and becomes the single provider of healthcare. Now, we know what it's like to have a single provider of anything, ESCOM. And funny enough, the lights went off here earlier on. So we had a taste of that. So anyway, jokes aside, obviously that would be a very bad approach. What you then do on health is actually you look to the market, you look to families. What you could do immediately is, for instance, you could break up the health budget, which I think is just over 300 and something billion rand every year. I just need to double check my numbers on that. I know the education one well because I say the same thing on this. Anyway, you break up the health budget into vouchers for families, right? So if there's a family of 4, you calculate what a division of the budget would look like. And essentially you dispense that in a voucher to a family, and that family can now have the freedom, the liberty, if you will, to buy the medical insurance that covers their family. Medical insurance, by the way, which would have a savings account, allowing them to tap into it to use for day-to-day care. Why shouldn't poor people have the same quality in terms of private sector health? Why shouldn't they have the same quality? Why should they go to a clinic where nurses give them the side eye and pretend as if they don't exist? Why? Because they're just poor people. That's insane. So if you really care about people, specifically, if you really care about poor people, then surely your aim should be to give them the exact same quality that those of us who are in the middle class, those of us who are rich, are enjoying. And where is that quality? In the private sector. So again, take the state, take government, take politicians, get them out of the way and put the resources into the hands of families and individuals.
Okay, so you've said the same for education, basically also a voucher system.
Absolutely. Let me be specific on this one because this one I care about the most. If you want to talk about the best way to institute an economic empowerment model, the real version of BEE, without the B, but just EE, should be education. Education is the single most powerful means of changing someone's life. I'm a beneficiary of that. The fact that I speak with this posh English accent, people ask me, oh, where do you get this accent from? I go, firstly, I don't put it on. Let's quickly get that out of the way. I grew up in Natal, and Natal has a tradition of very good English schools and, hold on to very strong traditions. And I'm a beneficiary of that network. Why? Because I got an opportunity in it. Bursaries in most cases, and parents who cared enough to get me into better schools. So the question becomes, why shouldn't we extend that same opportunity to poor people, poor families, poor children? Same thing. The education budget last year was 360 billion. That's a lot of money. It's the second largest spending behind the military. So what do? Right? You break that down, and the analysts in the Institute of Race Relations basically posit that you could give a family between 16 and 20,000 rand per child. I imagine that. A 16,000 or 20,000 rand voucher, which you can give to a poor parent and say, ma'am, you decide. We're not going to tell you to send your child to the local school, which is underperforming. The principal doesn't care. The teachers don't care. In fact, the teachers and principal of that school don't even send their kids to that school. They send them to the great schools outside of their neighborhood. So we're not going to force you as government to do that. We're going to give you a voucher. This voucher, you decide where you take your kids. You mean to tell me if you did that there wouldn't be a mushrooming of schools or private schools of quality trying to get that 16,000 rand in order to satisfy that market? I bet half the people in this room right now, and there's about 6 of us, I bet half of us in this room would start a school to be able to meet that sort of demand and provide the sort of quality education that changes the lives of people. You'd have specialized schools, drama schools, STEM schools, which I highly recommend. Learn to code, triggering the lefties. You'd have a diversity and a quality that reaches all the way down to your most dustiest rural area, your most poorest township area. In fact, you might have, for example, just a random one, because I was in Cape Town this morning. You might have there's a very famous school in Cape Town called Bishops, or SACS. You might have a SACS Khayelitsha or a St. Stithian's Garankua. In other words, these good schools that go, wow, there's now demand, there's a market, we can actually venture into these areas, make a little bit of profit, yes, because profit is a good incentive, but actually provide the same quality to poorer kids. That's the kind of society I want to build, where poor people are the winners, and actually really where everybody is a winner, but actually where everybody has an opportunity. That's the society I want.
I see here in the YouTube comments, our friend Roman Kabanak, who will, I think, speak about his party a bit later as well. But he asked he'd be interested to hear your opinion on gun rights, especially in South Africa, and what your thoughts on gun rights in South Africa are.
Well, as you can hear by that excitement on my side, I love guns. I really, 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 really love guns. And my love for guns stems from my family, Let me burst two myths here. I'm going to burst two myths. Pay attention, bursting blah, blah, blah myth on YouTube, on Twitter, you nasty trolls. I'm going to burst two actual myths here. One, the idea that Black South Africans are not responsible gun owners or don't have a gun tradition. Absolute poppycock, we do. My grandfather, who essentially what's the word? Credit, excuse me. I credit with changing the fortunes of my family. He was the innovator. He was the one who lifted us out of poverty and into the middle class. Essentially, he was from rural Stanger, Mapumulo. He was a sugarcane farmer and other stuff. And that's where my love for guns came from. Obviously, I didn't know him. He died before I was born. But the culture he left in the family was one of gun ownership, responsible gun ownership, teaching kids from a young age how to shoot, how to handle a weapon safely, and the importance of a weapon. That is, it is to protect this family, this property. And obviously, when you talk about protecting family and property, it's often usually against the state, or our version of the state, which is some random Nduna. Nduna is the king's proxy in your area who believes he has rights over your land, because we don't, unfortunately, have property rights over it. Anyway, I waffle, I digress. The point I'm trying to make here is we have a very long tradition of gun ownership and the responsible and safe usage of guns. So I'm a big gun advocate, I'm a gun nut. And the second one, in terms of his question, and the second myth I want to burst, is that actually having more guns in the hands of law-abiding citizens in this country would be a very good thing. It would not be a bad thing. Why? Because right now, if I'm to quote the police commissioner who was in Parliament last year, I think, his exact words were, right now, the mandate of the police is overstretched and the SAPs cannot meet it. That is a top cop in your country telling you that he cannot guarantee your safety, he cannot guarantee an efficient way of responding to you if there is something wrong. So therefore, who is your first responder? You. If you have something on your hip that's concealed and you carry it responsibly every day, you are more safer than the individual who leaves it to chance and says, well, let me just hope that at least within 8 minutes, somebody will come if I'm being mugged or raped or hijacked. One of those individuals has a better chance of surviving and protecting their rights to life and liberty than the other. And it's actually the concealed carry gun owner, or just period, the gun owner has that better chance.
So I think we have a quick question from our audience here. Can we give over the mic to her?
My name is Michelle. I have a question on what liberty means in Africa, and that is, isn't liberty itself anti-African? You just used the example where the king claims land in KwaZulu-Natal. So isn't it African communities traditionally where strong leaders make the decisions for the people, whereas you now say liberty gives power to the individuals?
Well, one has to be precise on that question. It's a great question, by the way. So is liberty anti-African is essentially the question. Well, when you say African, you also got to be specific, because Africa is not one monolith. For instance, the Zulus, the people I belong to, Zulus have a very long history of a federal way of organizing society, federal being devolving power to a local level, where you have and this is, by the way, thanks to Shaka Zulu in terms of how he organized the Zulu nation. He didn't organize it for it to become some weird bureaucratic state. He basically said, look, obviously using force and violence and conquest. In fact, it wasn't, bed and roses and, passing out bouquets of flowers to every village you walk past. It was conquest, it was war. And that's how the Zulu nation was forged, through war. steel on. Okay, well, anyway, I want to be flowery there, but I'll let it go. So, sorry, to answer your question, I mean, if you look at the Zulu nation, here is a visionary leader, Shaka, who organizes a people in a rather federal way. So he says, look, I am the king of the nation, but essentially I recognize that they are the Ngobese clan, my clan, who have their own king. He can rule his people and do as he pleases, hasta la vista and Chavez to you, Ngobese clan. There are the Buthelezis, the Mtetwas, blah, blah, blah. You go down the line. And that system of governance in the Zulu nation still exists today, where the king has a council, you will, of traditional leadership where power is devolved. Now, is that perfect? No. But it's definitely a step towards liberty because, for as much as the king was the greatest authority, you still had devolved levels of power. Is that the case in all of Africa? No. And I think where your question is more important is to look at what happened in African countries post-independence, right? Unfortunately, for most, if not all countries, the biggest intellectual thought, the biggest intellectual influence were socialists and Marxists, and not necessarily freedom-thinking, pro-capitalist, pro-market thinkers like Adam Smith, for example. So most of our African leaders went with Marx and Lenin and that sort of cohort. And you see this right through the line from Ghana, which was the first, to South Africa, which was one of the last, I think, to attain independence. All of them, in one iteration or the other, were either statist or outrightly socialist. So that is actually the biggest inhibitor you've had. Just while I'm on this point, because there's a lot of things happening in my mind in terms of references, a good book to read on this, in terms of Africa in particular and its path post-independence, is The State of Africa by Martin Meredith. That is perhaps one of the most comprehensive, it gives one of the most comprehensive accounts as to how bad ideas, socialism, statism, and big government and poor governance really affected all post-independent countries and how it happened. And I can tell you this, from page 1 to the very end, you'll start seeing a pattern. And with that pattern, you'll start understanding what's happening too in South Africa.
So just moving on to another aspect that government, especially in South Africa, last few years have been trying to get their grubby little hands on is speech. Can you perhaps get to that? Because I think it's an interesting point, and especially given the last 2 weeks, what we've seen happen, for example, with the Human Rights Commission, what they've said that whatever Julius Malema was saying about killing all whites in South Africa, well, not killing them, at least for now. And then looking at things like what happened with Vicky Momberg and Penny Sparrow and whatever. I think it's a sensitive topic for a lot of people on different ends of the political spectrum. So how do you view speech in South Africa, and where do we draw the line? Because I think a lot of people, if you're ideological, a lot of people would say no, free speech should be absolute. I had a conversation with Jonathan Witt over Twitter on exactly this point. And I agree to a very large extent with him, but I think there are lines to be drawn. I think some speech is dangerous, especially in South Africa.
Yeah, I think I err closer to the side of Jonathan's view on this, which is, firstly, before I go there, guys, free speech is super important. The only way you can have a society that understands each other is by allowing us to talk frankly to each other. If you create a society where some topics are taboo, or you can't say this because it's politically incorrect, or whatever the case may be, that is a society which is a fertile breeding ground for conflict and poor conflict resolution, period. Why? Because you have all these people who have this pent-up frustration, but they can't say anything about it. They can't express themselves freely. So free speech as a principle is super important to the health of any nation. That's the first principle that I stand on. In terms of where you then draw a line, if there is to be any line, is, for me, it is direct incitement of something. You cannot have a situation where you have, as was the case with the BLF leader, saying, hey, we are going to go to their farms or kill the people on their farms. For every one of us they kill, we'll kill 5. That is absolutely insane in what should be a functioning modern democracy. That individual is essentially inciting violence, and that is where the line should have been drawn, or should be drawn in a society that is pro-free speech. So that would generally be my view on that. There's 2 points. One, any solid, sound society it wants to be a modern democracy, has to have free speech. And you can't touch that principle. But where you do draw a responsible line is on the issue of direct incitement of violence.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to incorporate another question that we got from the internet along with one of my own questions, and then after that, I think we can take another question from the audience.
Sorry, can I add something?
Yeah,
just very quickly on free speech, because it's actually quite topical, and I enjoy this topic. Let me actually look at you also, when you talk about free speech, you also need to understand that you shouldn't also be legalistic in how you view it, right? Let me be precise and specific. Let me go to the Human Rights Commission's findings on Malema. Everybody sort of gasped when the HRC made its finding. I didn't necessarily. Unfortunately, even someone like Malema, reprehensible as he may be as a character, should have the freedom to speak. Ultimately, how do you know what he thinks about you? How do you know whether he's a good or bad person if you don't allow him to say the nonsense that swirls in his mind? So that you understand him. In understanding him, it doesn't just stop there. You have just as much the freedom to say something totally appropriate. Sorry, I had to sort of moderate my own language there because I think a swear word was coming out. But you have every right to essentially criticize, dismantle, and just absolutely decimate his bad ideas and make a fool of him in public with your right to free speech. So that when you look at the findings of the Human Rights Commission, for instance, don't get trapped in the legal definitions of what hate speech is. Just because they made a legal argument that it wasn't hate speech doesn't mean that morally what he says is not racist and absolutely hateful. Malema, from a moral perspective, is a terrible person when it comes to his ideas around different groupings in this country. So don't let the legal argument then rile you up and you become angry and irrational because like, oh, how dare they not call them that hate speech? That's just a legal argument. It doesn't change the fact that morally, if a normal person listens to him, they're able to quickly call him out as a hateful person, as he is.
Thank you for that. So the question, maybe moving into another gear, aiming at the 8th of May of this year, we have a question online asking, will Big Daddy tell us who he's going to vote for in May? Maybe we can incorporate that with your opinions of some of the smaller, newer parties, like specifically the South African Capitalist Party, who also seem to be aiming for the same market as you, and maybe they also promulgate a lot of freedom. Such as that.
Perhaps you can just tell us, are they sponsored by the IR or the Koch brothers? We're not sure. No, I'm just joking.
Our last payment of 100 billion was not enough. Of course not. Look, guys, generally speaking, I have a rule. I come from a party political background. I used to work in the DA as one of the political researchers in Parliament back in 2010. Oh my goodness, I'm a fossil. And I cut my teeth within the party for the longest of times, and the last sort of job I had within the party, not so much in the party, but within a DA-run government, was being a spokesperson to a provincial government that the DA runs. So I'm quite happy and open about that. Do I support the DA? No. Absolutely not, because the DA isn't the party, unfortunately, that I joined, right? But I'm not here to bash any political parties. I just wanted to get that out the way, because usually online people go, oh, but you used to work in the DA, and they post pictures of, which are freely available. It's not like I hide anything. Yes, CC bursting white myth.
The Liberty part of your logo is blue, though. I'm just saying.
Well, hey man, hint, just kidding. No, so guys, so to answer the question directly, I don't actually have a party that I support. And I can't tell you who I'll be voting for, because I'm one of those millions of South Africans who actually make up the majority in terms of the voter population, who, or in their case, don't vote because, clearly there's no one that provides a platform for them to vote for. Which brings me to the second part of your question. There's a lot of exciting smaller parties that are cropping up, and I think this election will be an election of smaller parties, to be honest. That's if they play their game, their cards right. I know you're probably piling towards the ZACP in that question, so I'll jump into them. The ZACP is exciting. It's a group of guys, a team of guys who got together with an idea and said, how do we change society, both through the levels of government and as a society, ideas in society. The 10 principles are interesting. And with that being said, let me quickly punt the show. I have been in talks with them with doing a show, a very special type of 3-part show with the ZACP, where we look at what they stand for and practically, in a real way. You should see my face right now. So I have a weird smirk, but in a very real way, testing their ideas in society. So we're busy planning that, and those episodes should be up within the next sort of 2 weeks or so. Once you film them, of course. So I won't say too much about the ZSEP, except to say it is a very exciting platform. Anybody who stands on the hill and says, actually, capitalism is great, and the freedom is absolutely fantastic, we should be cheering those people. We shouldn't be sort of trying to relegate them in the dark corner with a lollipop in the mouth, turned into the corner to sort of keep them quiet. These people should be given a platform to be heard. The Big Liberty Show does. It gives smaller parties also a platform. So I've already spoken to the Cape Party. I spoke to its leader, and that's also on the show if you look for it on YouTube.
Where can people find the Big Daddy Liberty Show? You might as well punt it.
Absolutely. So everything is on social media. I want to work on social media. So you can find the show itself, which is usually a weekly 30-minute show, unless I have some sort of special, which will be no more than sort of an hour, once a week. And often every second day or so, I vlog quite often, and I talk on topical issues. So go on YouTube, search Big Daddy Liberty or Big Liberty Show, and you'll find my content. Subscribe, like, share, and please subscribe, guys. Share the content, because I think more people need to hear and listen to this. And you'll also find my stuff on any social media platform generally, my thoughts and musings. But back to the question on smaller parties, because I think this has to be said. I will be also I will be interviewing the chaps at the Freedom From Plus, because I think they stand a very good chance in this election of seeing growth, because there's a lot of dissatisfaction with some of the larger parties. And of course the IFP, because I think they are primed to sort of make a bit of a bounce back. So that's the plan.
Cool. And then we have one more question from the audience.
It was interesting to me that you mentioned the Buthelezis under King Shaka as a sub-kingdom, because one of my friends at Res was actually Charity Buthelezi, and she always bragged about the fact that she has royal blood in her. So my question is, in the introduction, you mentioned two things. So firstly, and I do believe this, I agree with you fully on this, is that the overall, all South Africans really, they just want to have a good family life, have job security, and all that. And then the problem comes in. Political parties that segregate us, that put fights between us and makes the fight. How do we as normal South Africans, as these families wanting this, how do we fight against that, or how do we make that better in South Africa?
Great question. Look, to be brutally honest with you, and I'm going to answer it in a very different way. Bear with me. There's two elements to Big Daddy Liberty. There's I like to call it the air war. So that's the stuff I've been talking about. You'll find me on social media, lots of videos, hey presto, lots of fun. But also there's a ground war, something which I take very seriously. The Big Liberty Show and Big Daddy Liberty is primed to enter every single community in this country, to talk to ordinary people and to brief them on what they can do. So let me be precise. So from the Limpopo to the Cape, if you want Big Daddy Liberty in your community to come, deliver a short 20-minute speech, which has hard data, hard analysis around, firstly, where we are as a country, how we got here because of the bad ideas, and then obviously, secondly, what we can do to fight back. No, I'm not harping on to Freedom From Plus there, I'm just making a point. But just generally speaking, how we can actually begin to push back against the statism, push back against the socialism, push back against the racial bean counting of our politicians. If you want Big Daddy Liberty in your community, to deliver that speech and then have a frank conversation between you and your friends maybe, or you and a community that you may have organized, please invite me. Find me online, pop me a DM, pop me an inbox, and say, hey, I want you to come to Riversonnereinde. I only have 5 friends, and we'll do it over a braai. I will come to your community, even if you say it's only 5 people that I can put together, because I find that this is more important than the social media stuff. I need to begin to speak to all South Africans. And so far, I've been to quite a few places, and it's not just your more well-heeled areas. I've been in places where my bakkie can barely make it in. But essentially, you find a group of people who just want to hear the truth. Because right now, politicians are far from the truth, and that's all of them, unfortunately. Yes, you might have your favorite ones, but it's political silly season, so they'll say anything to you. So what I do in terms of the ground wall, the Friends of Liberty tour that I'm on, is to come to your neighborhood, come to your home, come to your local hall, something that you can organize with me, and I provide hard analysis. Where are we? What are we doing? So to then answer your question around what families can do, well, this is one avenue, right? I know this is shameless punting here, but
That's why we're here.
This is one avenue. I want people to invite Big Daddy, send me an inbox and say, listen, we are a family, we're worried at the moment. And I'm literally sharing an email that I received a week ago. Hey man, I'm a dad, recently married, 2 kids now, and I'm worried about my kids. I'm worried about the future of this country. What should I be doing? Should I be looking at a plan B? And those are the sort of emails I get. And it's not just from white South Africans. I have Black couples, Black professionals who are asking themselves the question, should I be staying here? I've worked so hard to get to where I am, but I feel like I'm not getting to the next level because I'm overly taxed. I can't open a business, or rather, my business is struggling because of all the red tape, the regulation. What do I do? But I'm too afraid to speak out because I'm supposedly a beneficiary of the system, right? So don't feel alone. Whoever's listening to me right now, don't feel like you are alone, that no one else shares this. You are the silent majority. The IRR does the most extensive polling of any organization in this country. And one of the polls, we asked people the question, do you think if South Africa were to succeed, do you think people of different races and different classes need each other? And an overwhelming 75% of people responded and said yes. If this country is to work, Black and white South Africans need to work together across the racial lines, across the class lines. So you're not alone. Now the issue becomes, how do we build on that? What do we do? And Big Daddy is in that fight. Excuse me. I want people to literally say, BD, come through. I've got 5 people, I've got 10 people. In some cases, I have 300 people. And I'll come out and I'll do a briefing and we can have this chat. Because ultimately, who do I stand for? I stand for the individual and I stand for families. And if we can build that broad coalition between Black and white South Africa, and we start seeing each other as South Africans, as individuals, as families, the politicians will run scared.
No, it's interesting because I think most South Africans, like you said, family is important to across the spectrum of any kind. People in South Africa are really, they love their families. The family is the unit of our country, and it makes absolute sense. Sihle, just to perhaps end this conversation off with one last question about the role of the state and what the state should do.
Yeah.
The state and religion, because I think that's perhaps an interesting topic, especially in Afrikaans, the Afrikaans community lately, given the court cases that we've seen with the Dutch Reformed Church and certain things like that. And yourself, you're also religious. So how do you see that relationship between the people, their religion, and the state functioning?
Yeah, look, I don't think the state has any role in regulating religion, just like the state doesn't have any role in regulating what happens in people's bedrooms, and the state doesn't have any role in regulating what happens in our families. Again, it comes back to that first point I made, that South Africans have never really tasted true freedom, whether it was under colonialism, apartheid, or even today. The state has always tried to do things that really shouldn't be its role. So on religion, I'm someone who's converting to Judaism, and I'm a deeply religious person. I don't throw my religion in people's faces, but that's the beauty about freedom, right? That's the beauty about liberty, is that you can be whoever you want to be as long as you don't harm the next person. And that same principle should apply to the various religious communities in this country. Because if you really look at South Africa, South Africans, even through the diverse religions, the diverse cultures, we get along. You can have communities. I mean, let me speak about Cape Town maybe, because most of my adult life has been there. Big Muslim community, relatively big Jewish community, obviously big Christian community, because Christians make up the majority in this country. But you don't see the sort of sectarian violence that we have around the world. For instance, the last time we had any form of that sort of religious violence in this country was in the sort of early mid-90s, really. And that was because there was a particular grouping called PAGAD, the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, who kind of whipped up a religious fervor to fight gangsterism. But even that wasn't necessarily some sort of religious fundamentalism that was going to change, the country or whatever the case may be. I waffle. The point I'm making is this: the state shouldn't have a place at all in telling people what they should be, how to praise, where to praise, etc., etc. As long as the principle of whatever you do in your religion doesn't harm other people, then you should have the freedom to be whoever you want to be.
I think we have one last question to end off this discussion from the audience. Sorry, I didn't think it switched on. Oh, there you go.
So my name is Daniel. I've actually got two questions. I'm only asking the one, but I'm mentioning the other one, hint, hint. And that's if you maybe have any recommendations. If you had to recommend one book, what would it be? But that's not actually my question. So you can answer that one if you feel like it later, maybe. My real question is with regard to so my sense of the South African situation is we've got a lot of political rhetoric, but we've also got a lot of interesting ideas blowing over from overseas, especially the US. And I think, for instance, we discussed the Malema incident a while back, and I think that the Human Rights Commission's report was very heavily inspired by ideas like intersectionality, etc. So this is more like just kicking things into a slightly different gear. What's your sense about the influence that international rhetoric has on the South African situation?
Okay. Great questions. First one being a tricky one because I wanted to recommend three, if I may. Life, Liberty, and Property by Bastiat. Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. And Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. Those three books will get you there quickly. Okay, on to your second question. And let me just phrase it properly. Let me see if I captured it properly. The question is the influence of the international community on South Africa. Is that? I think the international community doesn't really care about South Africa. We are a yesteryear story. We were great in the 90s because here's this wonderful country that's ending oppression and essentially is ushering in a new age. That was the greatest story of that age, arguably of the 20th century. Well, there's better ones, but anyway, let me be a patriot for a moment. And the next best story, and people sort of raise their eyebrows when I say this, was a government in this country which was actually beginning to get some things right. Hey? The ANC weren't a complete stuff up. There is a period of growth in this country between 2003 and 2007. We were seeing 5% year-on-year growth. And from that economic prosperity, 10 million more people found employment. That's amazing. 10 million more people were earning an income. In other words, not dependent on the state. And then second to that, the government paid back its loans, its debt. And with the surplus, which you started seeing, was able to then roll out more social services. Now, regardless of what your view on it, if you look at the data, the hard data, that those social welfare programs lifted a lot of people out of absolute abject poverty. It gave them just a bit of a foot up to be able to then access, or what should have been access, better opportunities through what should have been a better education and blah blah blah. That's where they failed. The ANC, if you're to be critical. One more random example or anecdote. When I say the ANC weren't a complete failure, for every 10 for every one shack that was built from 1994, 10 formal houses were built in this country. So there is good news, and we know the ANC knows what to do, right? If we were to actually whip them into shape, they would know what to do. They need to go back to that form of the ANC. But that is a pipe dream that I ask people to let go of. Because when I say this, then people go, so there's hope in the new dawn then? Should we be hopeful about this? And I say, no, unfortunately. The new dawn is it's a mirage. It's a fake fugazi that you should actually sort of warn yourself against. And I will come back to your question. I just want to paint this broad picture. The new dawn is what the new dawn is what the bad politicians are putting the good politicians forward as the mirage to the international community to keep the narrative going that South Africa is doing well. Look, we're fixing this, we're fixing that. But in reality, the bad politicians are the ones, they're like the men behind the curtains. They hold the real power because South Africa is one heart attack away from having David Mabuza as our president. Sorry, I don't know why I did that. We're one heart attack away, or one resignation away from having David Mabuza as president, and a few more steps away from Ace Magashule as a potential president or a potential leader. Those are really bad men. So that any idea that somehow, and I know you're not saying this, but I want to infer it, that the international community will step in, or they'll make sure the ANC don't do anything radical, is a foolish thing to believe. And I think vlog 7 that I released, I had this conversation where I said, no one's going to save the country. There'll be no men in Superman capes or guys in business suits with briefcases who march into Luthuli House from the IMF. If you can have a country like Venezuela, which used to be one of the richest countries in the world, collapse to the point where it is one of the poorest, where they have load shedding 100% for days on end, people eating out of the garbage trucks. 3 million people estimated to have fled to neighboring countries, and they used to be the richest country, not only just in South America, but the world. That tells you a story of how, if their politicians can see nothing wrong with that, because they still believe in the socialist project, our politicians are just as bad. And let me be precise and specific. 3 weeks ago, Tony Ngeni, one of the senior NEC members in the ANC, took a delegation of the ANC, flew across to Venezuela. They didn't tell you this part. They probably stayed in very nice hotels. They saw all the nice parts of Venezuela, but came back and then gave a glowing report of how great Venezuela and their leader there, Maduro, is. So that should be the warning sign for any South African, that if they can say that about a country that patently has collapsed, has failed, they basically are willing to take their chances and say, well, hey, South Africa can get to that stage, but we'll still be in power. We'll still maintain power. That is the socialist mind. That is the socialist politician's mind. I mean, we have a neighbor who completely, essentially collapsed, Zimbabwe, for those who are wondering. Learn your geography, people. We had a neighbor who collapsed, and we saw millions of Zimbabweans, good people. I mean, these are guys. Don't get me wrong. I don't blame the people necessarily. You have a situation where some people are just fooled into voting for things that sound great, and socialism sounds great. You're building a utopia on earth. Hey, man, let's do that. The problem is, if you vote it in, as in most cases around the world, socialism has been, if you vote it in, you have to shoot your way out of it or just flee. And that's what most people do. They flee. I digress. So back to your question. I don't think the international community necessarily cares about South Africa that much. I think you have those who do care for their own selfish purposes. So you have, for example, the BRICS countries, specifically China and Russia, who look at us and they sort of lick their lips because they can see the collapse and they would want to make as much money from us in our state of collapse as possible. Not necessarily to help this country, but to make a quick buck. And the ANC would be more than willing to have a crony relationship with them. So does the international community really have sway with us? I don't think so. And you see this in how the ANC also speaks now about ratings agencies, almost to say, yeah, look, it's important, but when you start having politicians say stuff like that, just know that in the back of their minds, they know that they can get funding elsewhere. And usually those pockets of funding come with serious repercussions.
Big Daddy Liberty, thank you so much for coming on. Just one more time, where can people find you? Where can we follow you? Where can we read your stuff, listen to your stuff? Where can we get more Big Daddy Liberty?
All right. Guys, as I said, I'm on social media. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Just search Big Daddy Liberty or The Big Liberty Show and you'll find me. And guys, please support the work I do. I'm wholly dependent on contributions from the public. We have a crowdfunding campaign called the Friends of the IRR. And, if you watch any of my videos, I always end it off by saying, if you want to support my work, if you want to support me so that I'm able to do the work, go to every community, put out the content, SMS your name to 32823. It's a R1 SMS. Terms and conditions do apply. But someone will give you a call back and they'll sign you up. It's a monthly debit. And on average, please don't freak out. The average we get is between 70 Rand and 90 Rand a month. So 2 or 3 cups of coffee. Oh, yikes, depends where you buy them. And you're supporting me. Those 70 Rand and add up. They allow me to travel around, be able to get to locations, do briefings with people who otherwise would not be able to afford to bring me out there. So if you can support Big Daddy Liberty, please do. You can also do that. You can sign up by finding us online, irr.org.za/join. For those who are more tech savvy and are wondering, what is an SMS? Or hey, find Big Daddy Liberty on Patreon and throw a few shekels my way, a few rands my way. And it's this money that I use to get around the country to be able to talk to poor South Africans, rich South Africans, all South Africans, so that we can build a freedom-loving and a prosperous nation.
Thank you very much once more. To you as listener, be sure to subscribe to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast. Wherever you get your dose of weekly or daily podcasts, please leave us a review on iTunes or CastBox. And yeah, so we'll enjoy your participation in that. The Death, Taxes, and Change podcast is proudly brought to you by Podmedia.